how are you dealing with the kind of fracture of trust in our society, and then the need to use data that's really being collected across society for people to believe that, yeah, you get it right. You're doing okay. You know, we really believe in what you're doing. And then the other part I want to say, and this is the second part of that, and this is actually inspired by something you showed, Nayeli, which was uh, at what point in collecting data can we be transparent about what's going on? So any one of those two.
I'm glad that you liked that that aspect of the project, Caesar. I agree that the issue of trust, especially when it comes to trust about digital systems and data collection, is really challenging, and something I think that we're still very much not decided on our approach. I think what you saw there was one attempt of many attempts to try something and see if people responded to it and see if it would work. But it is an incomplete attempt, and something that I think, you know, we wouldn't say that's like the solution or the only way to do things. And I will say that one strong conclusion that we all came to after deploying that system of signage is that, you know, transparency is sort of the first thing that we should aspire to, but beyond that is actually building systems to hold ourselves accountable. Because just because we create the opportunity to share data or to make systems transparent doesn't mean that they're actually accessible, and doesn't mean that people are actually able to use them to hold us accountable to our word when we say that we're protecting privacy or that we're not surveilling people. So, you know, this was the first step, but we acknowledge, I think, that there's aspirations beyond that, and that would be, you know, accountability, and also, you know, really building user agency to, you know, take these systems into their own hands and use them for the advocacy or research that they need, not just what the city thinks is important.
And that was an open question to all of you, and you can feel free to jump in at any point in time when you've got it. And I can't tell. Go ahead.
I could follow in. Just, I think, just on what Nayeli is saying, which, by the way, I did love that project, Nayeli. It's really cool. But I think that, you know, the way we handle it is we think trust and transparency are intimately related. I think those two questions are intimately related. So what we do is we basically, when you sign into IC Change, and you're signing in with one of our partners, like whether it's the City of Miami or Museum of Science in Boston or kind of the Health Department in New Orleans, we say very upfront, like, we're sharing this data with this partner to try and make a solution for you. And it's, you know, like signposting it very upfront. People are asked to volunteer their location data per post, and that not only tells, you know, is a voluntary act. We're not scraping it from your phone, but we're actually getting better data, because often people can be posting from places where they're not physically located, and it messes up when you scrape Twitter or whatever the social media is, because they're not designed for that. And so we're actually getting better at more accurate data and more details. And then with our kind of our client side version of IC Change, which we are kind of, which we did in co-design with a lot of our kind of the groups that we work with, the educators, the cities and utilities, and the engineers, is this idea of like signposting that the users that you've seen their data and that you're using it and thanking them for that. And doing that at scale is really challenging. So we're developing ways for, like, with quick buttons for people to be able to say, actually, that was really useful, and we're going to take that into consideration in design, or we're going to send out a backtrack or whatever, so that people, the residents, actually say, oh wow, that was helpful. And then it encourages that behavior, and also encourages the kinds of posts that, you know, city governments find useful. So really, you know, creating that dialogue and trust, and actually generating better results.
I like what you're saying there, Julia, about a dialogue. I think that in terms of the collaboration with our partner cities in Canada and France, we're seeing a lot of similar problems related to this tied together issue of transparency and trust. And the common feeling among all of the cities is that we need to do more as far as improving the agency of the communities that are involved in you know, a potential situation where privacy could be breached, or in generally not understanding the way that that data is being used in our open spaces. And that kind of dialogue you're talking about is really important to that feeling of agency, where you can build up the trust as long as the folks that are being impacted by this data collection feel like they have a say.
And I'll just add to that. One of the challenges that we see is not just in how data is used that's already been collected, but what data is being collected to begin with. And sometimes the data that's being collected is not the data that's meaningful for the people that the data is being collected for. So we're seeing this through the network. We've been doing some work around emergency food provision in the city of Boston and understanding the disparities between the data that's being collected on the mutual aid level versus the data that's being collected by the city or even the nonprofit sector as it pertains to food insecurity and who needs it and what the issues are. And in some cases, what we're seeing is that on the local level, there's a much deeper kind of qualitative understanding of the issues, obviously. And then on the city level, there's a broader overview of what the issues are, but that sort of deep local understanding isn't there, and there aren't the mechanisms really to translate from one to the other, because the city can't hear the qualitative stuff. Sometimes for purposes of liability, and sometimes just for unwillingness, and then the communities don't want to deal with the top level stuff, right? It doesn't seem relevant. And so I think the question of this matter of dialogue is so important in every step of the data process, from collection to use to analysis. That to really sort of engage people early on and to develop what we've been calling these collaborative data protocols. So can we sort of create a set of rules that would exist across the sort of data lifespan for communities and municipal actors?
No,
I'll just add to that
yes, please do,
quickly.
Rachel. Yes.
Just quickly, Eric said it well. Just what we're learning in working deeply with our community partners is that it needs to go beyond transaction, right? Trust is not a transactional thing. It's not you put this in and you get trust out, but it really is. It's relational. And so even when it feels, even though that's hard, it's hard work, and so this dialogue and anything that is helping to build that relationship and helping people to feel like they are invested from as early as possible in whatever the project is critical.
In all of these efforts, one thing, and we were just touching on it, is that we really, in order to understand what's going on in any place, we have to rely on really different kinds of data that come from different forms. And some of those can be the data, people's experiences and dialogues. Some of those can be measurements we've taken. And of course, we need to have these conversations with people so people can, between sectors and between organizations and different viewpoints. And then we have these, like I said, these other kind of data and allowing people to understand what those are. But at some point, somewhere, someone is making sense of all of that. So where does that happen? How does that happen? And how do we, what's the big problem we're trying to solve there? I mean, what's the breakthrough you've made on that? Or what are the challenges you see we still have to deal with? Or how do we do sense making across all of this stuff?
I think one challenge that I will speak to, or like another aspiration that I have, is not only to have the city be better at processing or understanding and intaking the qualitative data, like Eric was talking about before. I think we need to do a better job of that, and should, and are interested in lots of ways to doing that. I guess I also wish that we had a better ability as members of the community to, I guess, push back on some of the assumptions or some of the sense making that the so-called experts are doing with this quantitative data. Because, for better or for worse, right now, a lot of decisions are made on that basis. And I feel like a lot of times that expertise is used to shut down really legitimate pushback that communities might have, just by, pointing to a quantitative study or pointing to data. And then that sort of shuts down the conversation, because not everybody can engage with the data at that, with that vocabulary. And so I wish that we spent more time and resources building that capacity in communities so that when experts, ourselves included, try to pivot back to the data because that's our comfort zone, that the communities in those conversations could say, well, actually, we have that same language and we have that same vocabulary, and we're going to meet you on that level. You know, I think we need to bring ourselves to the quantitative conversation, but we also need to make sure that we're investing in the ability of communities to bring themselves to the, qualitative and quantitative.
Yes.
What I'm saying.
Yes, we got it.
I can follow that, Nayeli. I think I'm just gonna come after you after every time. So one of the things that IC Change is innovative around is the syncing of qualitative and quantitative data as a singular product. Like, we collect both from the community, and that allows us to enter the conversations around modeling. That allows us to enter and have and be taken seriously in technical conversations, whether it's with cities or engineers, because we can actually look at the data and sync it to the quote unquote, their source of truth on both sides of the equation, both with the user community, the residents, the public, and with the not the engineers as much, but the cities, particularly the decision makers. We have to do a major and where we've had breakthroughs is in these kind of community meetings where both get to come together and look at the data that's been collected. We have to do education on the fact that a data model is not truth. A data model is our best guess. And often residents have, ground truth and proven the model is wrong. We've seen that happen for our heat work. We've seen that happen with our flooding work. And, do the math on climate models. There's a lot of error in the system. Even with the next generation satellites and sensors, there's errors. So, really doing the education, saying like, we can work together to make the data much better and more accurate and more meaningful to us in terms of the qualitative data and insights we bring to the table in our daily lives. So if you're going to solve this problem, taking into account our experiences. So, elderly residents having heat strokes in their front yards, maintaining their gardens, when green infrastructure is planned and there's no maintenance planned for that. Right? That's a conversation. And that's one that can be taken seriously when the anecdotes are matched with that data and we can all come to the table with the same information. But it does require education on both sides of the equation. And it's been very powerful to actually have the engineers validate it. They actually will say, the first point of failure in a hydrology is a model. And yet that's where we make most of our decisions.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on that. I mean, so I've been doing some research with municipal decision makers around like how they're using data and how they're thinking about data. And what's super interesting and perhaps a little bit optimistic is that what I'm hearing from people is that people who work for city governments is that they understand the limitations of data for the most part, right? Like, people understand that data sets are incomplete. People understand that there's bias in these data sets. So that's great. That's like the first part of the problem, is that there's a general understanding from many people within city governments. I mean, not to mention the, city government representations here on this panel, but even beyond you, there is an understanding of this that seems to be fairly widespread. And the challenge is that the mechanisms by which they make decisions are the same, even though the individual actors understand the problems, right? So it's often that the still sort of the processes of decision making and the sort of bureaucratic entanglements of decision making are still the same. But individuals understand that, oh, okay, this is incomplete, this is biased, but we still have to make the decision in the way that we've done it. And so I think we have an opportunity to sort of take that perhaps new awareness that decision makers have and start actually thinking about the processes of decision making within government to do all the things that Julia was just mentioned and Nayeli had mentioned of actually sort of generating that kind of sort of moving that understanding to actual dialogue and process and policy, hopefully.
Matt, are we stepping all over your ground here? You want to?
No, yeah, I think that what Eric just said about moving the needle that we're at toward process and executing on this rather than just having a mutual understanding that's something that resonates. And maybe I don't have something quite as optimistic or positive to add. I think this is something that internally at the City of Boston we feel very heavily, is that there's a trade-off here where if we want to be supplying systems in a way that is effective and efficient for our constituents, there's a perception within all of that bureaucratic inertia that you're sacrificing some of that ability in order to get that higher engagement. And that's something that I think on an individual level, we really try to push back on, that you can make gains in terms of effectiveness and even efficiency when you more fully understand the problem, and getting that qualitative understanding tied to the quantitative understanding that maybe we typically tend to leverage for our decision making, that is important, and that's something that will actually serve us well. But as the folks have already said in the last few minutes, there's a trade-off that's perceived, I think, among decision makers there, and that's something that's really hard to get past.
No,
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, please. Yes.
Sorry. So, in terms of that perception, if you have use cases that demonstrate that's not the case, that there's plenty of technology allowing engagement to happen in a very efficient way and potentially even making the solutions more efficient, how would you suggest, approaching that perception or changing that perception?
I think that there's a culture shift that is kind of already happening to a certain extent. So the good news is that to some degree, it's just a matter of time. But a more active approach might be that the storytelling component of this, I think, is really important, and the way that we can the demonstration of that kind of effectiveness that you're talking about, Julia, it needs to reach the right people. So I would love to see action and activity directed toward the storytelling of situations in which access to that more ground truth, community level, qualitative perspective is allowed to percolate upward to the eyes that need to see it. Yeah.
So, we're getting close to the end, unfortunately, because I think we could go longer and deeper. So I have one question for each of you. You can give you like 30 seconds to answer it. And I'll give you 15 seconds to collectively think about it. 30 seconds each to answer it. But I'd like you to kind of just kind of look out into the future and thinking about the work you have now, and just like, what's the questions that at the edge of your work? It's kind of like, yeah, here's where we are, but boy, if we could just kind of move on this question, things could go a lot better. So like, what's that question that's really kind of like at the edge of your work? Maybe it's not a question, maybe it's just a thought, but something that's out there that when you look at your work and you look at where you're going, it would just really be helpful to kind of know more about, understand better. Yeah. And this is your 15 minutes, is 15 seconds of silence and work. And now it's time to start. Who's going to start us off? Rachel, thank you.
Oh, Rachel, please.
Yeah, I'll start. And actually, I'm looking at the questions in the chat, and one of those really rose to the surface for me. And my interest definitely lies in community agency. And one of the questions in the chat here is, how do we enable resident agency at scale? And I think that's something that's of critical importance to our work. Like we really believe strongly in community voice and experience being centered in decision making. And how do you do that in a way that actually is able to that's at scale, and not just those with the loudest voices or the most time to show up and let their voices be heard are the ones who are influencing decision making, but really, how do we reach those populations that don't have the time or the language access or digital access or whatever that access is, right? And really being able to do that at scale so that we can, that it's true community participation and leadership, and not just the loudest and easiest to access.
Julia, you want to go? You were going to jump in there. So.
Yeah, Rachel, we can definitely talk about those questions anytime. But I think on the edge of my brain, you're like, you asking me look out, which is like, I rarely get to do that, but reflection is critical, right? We're really after paradigm shift. That's really what our goal is as a company, as an organization. And we're wanting, I mean, on the edge of my mind is like wanting to know how far we can push it. When we put our attention towards a specific impact that is really impacting community, and then we really spend the time on developing the processes and the technology to solve it, we hit it out of the park. And I want to know how far I really sincerely want to know how far this can go, like in everything that we've tried. So, you know, beyond the climate impacts, like designing for the future with, you know, of carbon, you know, zero or carbon negative, and making sure that the people who are least heard have an opportunity to participate, and it's not a tax on their time, but rather a badge of pride. Like being civically engaged didn't really happen for me as a human, as a person, until I had a mortgage and a kid in school, and, you know, and even understanding what you know, how powerful city council is. Like there's this like level of engagement at the very, you know, at all tails of society where we can make engaging with your community and your government to make a solution is the thing, is as cool as, you know, your TikTok video.
Yeah, yes.
You know, you know, that's my dream. So.
Thanks. So before they kick us out, Eric, Matthew, and then Naida.
Yeah, let me follow up on that. So I'll just say that for me, you know, for the most of my academic career, I've focused on what I've liked to call the sort of front end of participation. I've been really interested in sort of creative and effective modes of public engagement. What has occurred to me recently, and why my work has shifted to these questions of collaborative governance, and I've immersed myself into that research space, is that the question is not so much how do we get more input, but the question is how do we change the logics by which institutions take in that input and make decisions. And unless we do that, and I think this is the paradigm shift that Julia is talking about, unless we do that, then more input is not going to lead us anywhere. More data is not going to be good for us. And so I'm very invested in that question, and it actually does keep me up at night. How do we change the logics? How do we change the mechanisms of decision making?
I guess I'm maybe going to shift gears to look here a little bit, but the burning question at the top of my mind when I think about the larger scale commonalities between even, you know, on the country level, between different cities around the world that are facing a lot of these same challenges that we've been talking about today. There are standards, especially data-driven standards, that are popping up everywhere, saying we should do this, governments should have these regulations. Academic partners are coming up with all kinds of rules and guidelines and frameworks, and it's become a very messy space. And it's very difficult to weigh in this space without feeling like you're just adding one more framework or one more rule to a long list that already exists. And from a policymaking perspective, it's really challenging to know where to look and who to pay attention to. So, you know, I guess what I'm thinking about at the highest level is how do we get some kind of, you know, crystallize some truth from all of that mess? And is there any way that we can have a gold standard or have some kind of guiding principle that elevates above that mess of more specific standardization, especially in the data space?
Thank you. And Nayeli, you get to close us out.
I can be brief. I just have two words, and that's climate resilience. We've been visualizing climate data for a while now, and there's some really cool stuff out there. And Julia, you're definitely a part of that, your organization is, but none of it seems to be really getting through in any kind of dramatic way, or way that's talk about paradigm shifting the way that communities and governments are responding to climate change. and making communities more resilient. So I'm really looking forward to anything that disrupts that space and makes climate resilience more accessible and more actionable, because it's really important.
Thank you. Eric, Rachel, Matthew, Nairi, Julia, thank you so much. It's been wonderful talking with you, the presentations. David, thank you for your guidance. And I think with that, we'll let you all go and send people off to the next session. David?
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your amazing work. We thank you for joining the BARI conference this year, and we hope that you're able to continue with us over the next couple of weeks and in joining our next session next week in our topical panels as well. We thank you all, and you guys have a great weekend.
Take care. Bye-bye.